All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today we have Professor Dr. Monika Pukli from University of Strasbourg joining us, and she will give a talk on resonating heritage, phonological variation in Scots and English of Scotland today. I will very shortly introduce Professor Pukli to you and then leave the floor to her. Professor Pukli is currently the co-chair of the Excuse the French, Langage, Parole and Variation research program at the LILPA research unit in Strasbourg University and assistant director of the School of Modern Humanities. She earned her PhD from the University of Toulouse, Jean Jaurès, and her habilitation from the University of Paris-Cité. Her research focuses on the conceptualization of phonology and linguistic change in the context of complex systems as well as socio-phonetic variation in general. Additionally, she works on corpus phonology with a particular emphasis on the construction of learner corpora. She has taught courses in the BA and MA programs of the English department covering topics in phonetics, phonology, and sociolinguistics. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Good. Okay, so hello everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers, first of all, Lecce and Christina. Thank you very much for providing me with this opportunity to be here today and talk about Scottish voices and cultural memory, and also for putting together this fantastic program on cultural memory studies. So I'm really happy to be part of this. So this lecture aims to explore the connection between language and cultural memory, specifically focusing on phonological variation within Scots and English spoken in Scotland. So I thought let's start with an extract from one of the famous poems of Robert Burns, written in the 18th century. This one's entitled To a Mouse, or should I say To a Moose? And we'll just listen to the beginning.
We sleekit, cowling, timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie. Thou need na start to wassy hasty with bicker and brattle. I would be laith to run and chase thee with murder and battle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal.
So with a series of linguistic analyses, this session will look at how phonological features of Scots and Scottish English function as linguistic repositories, and as such, how they are able to capture and preserve historical, social, regional markers that contribute to form the collective identities and cultural memory of Scotland today. I'd like to refer explicitly here at the beginning to one of the texts that you're reading for the classes. This is Jan Assmann's Communicative and Cultural Memory. And I'm going to read a short quote from this text. And my issue is not so much the contention whether or not communicative and cultural memory should be treated separately, which was the main contention of this paper. And I must warn you that I'm not a specialist on cultural memory at all. You'll see that I master more or less the basic concept, and you'll see that I'll try to bring in language each and every time I can see the opportunity. So my issue with this text is what he claims on page 2010, then 110 and then 111. So I quote, "Cultural memory is a kind of institution. It is exteriorized, objectified, and stored away in symbolic forms that, unlike the sounds of words or the sight of gestures, are stable and situation transcendent. They may be transferred from one situation to another and transmitted from one generation to another." So actually you'll learn today that the sounds of words are stable, we'll see phonological features that are with us since the period we call Old English. And if you study sociolinguistics, but I'm going to address this point towards the end of the lecture when I offer a sort of conclusion of all the discoveries that you are going to make with me today. So if you study sociolinguistics, you realize that while some speech characteristics are situation dependent, this was one of the main discoveries of the 1960s with the start of the variationist sociolinguistic studies, mainly led at the beginning by William Labov. Many others are transferred from one situation to another, as speakers are not simply carriers of social meaning or social roles, but also creators and active agents that create their dynamical, multifaceted identities, linguistic identities. But more on this in the final part of the lecture. One thing is sure, if the sounds of words were not transmitted from one generation to another, phonology would not exist. Babies would not be able to learn how to speak or how to sign the gestures of the sign language of their parents. In other words, despite the huge variation you can all hear and see in language, there is also stability, and my lecture will show you some examples from Scotland. I'll talk about phonological variation in Scots and English spoken in Scotland, but also about specific phonological features and how they capture, preserve, and represent a historical, social, or a regional trait. And also, most importantly, I'll be talking about how the diverse setup of these phonological features contribute to shaping Scotland's collective identity and potentially, we'll see, the cultural memory of the speakers. So in this introductory part, I thought that was some key terms needed to be defined, since we'll be dealing with these throughout the lecture. So these include, most importantly, language, phonology, and phonological features. Now, language is the toughest one, so I'm going to leave this to the end. Let's start with phonology. We can say that phonology refers to the system-like organization of meaningless carriers, phonemes, that are typically spoken or signed in meaningful units, morphemes. So this is my own somewhat awkward definition of what phonology is. I'm going to explain what this means. This states two basic things about how we speak or how we sign. The sounds, in definition, d, f, n, sh, n, are meaningless by themselves when they are pronounced separately. The d in definition is meaningless and sounds like other d sounds, pretty much like the d in day or dinosaur, or even a bit like the d in hidden or hide. The similarity can be debated, that's all about phonetics, but it definitely does not have any meaning, whereas morphemes and words typically have a meaning, lexical or grammatical. So you have words like define, definition, definitely, li, indefinitely, I'd. So there you go, d is actually also a morpheme. In I'd, it stands for would or had. So one single sound could be meaningful. There are other examples like I, O, d in I'd. But there's just one or couple of meanings, whereas when they are combined, they can create thousands of different meanings. The second point about the definition of phonology is that phonemes are believed to be organized into a system. And in other words, this means that their behavior is not like random, but the patterns can be observed. So some sounds hang out with other sounds more than others. So, for example, the bunch of p, t, k show similar behavior, or m, n, ng also. And so they are natural classes or part of natural classes. But that's really just the second point that's not really important to relevant today. So because phonemes are meaningless, they can serve subtle social purposes and reflect characteristics that even the speaker is unconscious of. So these are mainly social characteristics, obviously, but not only. So for example, there are early medical signs of cognitive pathologies like Alzheimer's disease that are very early shown in how, for example, we pronounce vowel sounds. So our pronunciation of vowel sounds changes even before the first sign of the condition. So this capacity is one of the highlights of variation in sociolinguistics. Let me quote from a paper written by two of the most well-established representatives of variation in sociolinguistics, that is Lebov, that I already mentioned, and Penelope Eckert. So as they say, and I quote, and you have the source of each quotation on the slide itself instead of collecting them in a bibliography at the end. So I quote, "Linguistic variation has consistently been found to have social meaning in its association with the status and stance of speakers in the context of interaction. This indexical function of variation can contribute to the advancement of ongoing linguistic change. Style shifting in individual sociolinguistic interviews is an indirect indication of social meaning, but the clearest demonstrations are found in studies of speakers in a range of social contexts." Highlights are always mine, so highlights there in blue. Phonological variables are most readily adapted to convey social meaning by their frequency, flexibility, and freedom from referential function. And this is essential for today's lecture. And this is how we're going to relate language to cultural memory and accents of Scots and English in Scotland today. Not because social meaning of sounds or stylistic variation is so important. It could be also analyzed in their proper right in relation to cultural memory. No, we'll take these frequent, flexible, and meaningless features and see how they are related to the past, and with this relationship, how they are an active part of Scottish identities today. Second, phonological features. So the term phonological feature refers to a number of different things. So I just selected some examples there so that you can have a vague idea what I mean when I say phonological feature. So a phonological feature can be a place of articulation. For example, we can compare places of articulation between languages. So I thought the R sound would be a good example. And I'm going to go and visit the IPA website there to show you how they sound. Can you see? Of course you can't, so I'll just... Okay. So let's start with a French-sounding R. Okay. And well, this is what traditionally Scottish R is said to sound like. It's not exactly true. Okay, or just a regular English sounding R. Okay. O. Never mind. Okay. Another phonological feature would be vowel lengths. So let's listen to the difference in vowel length of the oo sound. This is a Scottish example.
Rude, 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 rude.
Okay, so this is spelled with the B-R-E-W-E-D.
Rude.
And this is a double O.
Rude.
Okay. Or it can be simply voicing The pronunciation, this is a classic example, pronunciation of the word writer in 2 accents. So I'm just going to use a dictionary there, and I hope I can go there directly. I'm sorry. So let's do it like this. Using the link. Let's quit the presentation. And so you can see the link. And so let's listen.
Writer. Writer.
So that's an unvoiced or voiceless pronunciation, and the same word.
Rider. Rider.
With a voiced t in the middle. Okay, so these are all different phonological features. You'll see that for today's lecture I selected some more phonological features, obviously, so that you can have a lot of them. And so I don't think I can get away without a definition of a language. So we can say that language in humans operates on the original coupling of meaningful and meaningless units, words and phonemes, thus possessing an ever-changing number of words and an infinite number of possible combinations of words, that is, sentences. Its main purpose is communication and is structured in nested complex systems, being one of the many examples of complex dynamical systems in society. So this is, like the previous one, my fairly awkward definition, but you can look up a definition of language in any textbook. So you have to go beyond the defining capacities of a dictionary or an encyclopedia, but you take any online linguistic textbook on language, and you'll never have this exact same definition of language. And so when I read one of the other texts that you're studying for this class, I cannot help but notice that one of the passages there, namely on page 15. So it's the invention of cultural memory, a short history of memory studies. On page 15, the foundational works of Maurice Halbach are commented on. And so I noticed that there is a distinction between collective memory, and I quote there, collective memory as the organic memory of the individual, which operates within the framework of a socio-cultural environment, and collective memory as the creation of shared versions of the past, which results through interaction, communication, media, and institutions within small social groups, as well as large cultural communities. So this resembles exactly how human language works and is studied. So we have the organic language of the individual, the language faculty we all have, allowing a person to learn and understand German or French or whichever language they are born into, on the one hand, and then there's a shared version of language, that is discourse, instances of language usage that results through interaction. But this is just a side issue, and we're not central to my points today. Of course, you might also object that language is a primary condition to access to memory, that without language one cannot gain access to either the immediate socio-cultural environment or the collective memory of smaller and larger groups. But you'll see that the issues that are raised today are not connected to this basic function of language. So let me zoom in on what we are going to deal with today. And let me quote again a definition, this time from an introductory book to American English, and what the authors say about language choices in communication. Social context is a major factor that drives our language choices. For example, consider the language you might have used in an interview situation, perhaps with a prospective employer or college admissions officer. If you are like many other people, in the interview, you probably were as much concerned with how you spoke as with what you actually said. You may have even practiced sounding confident, for instance, or intelligent, so that you would make a good impression during the interview. We make decisions every day or have decisions made about us by other people based on the language we use. We frequently evaluate a person's education, socioeconomic level, background, honesty, friendliness, and numerous other qualities by how that person speaks. And when we want to make a particular impression on someone else, we consciously choose our language just as we choose our hairstyles or clothing. Okay, so this is a sort of a definition that is more directly related to today's topic. So I hope now that it is more meaningful to you when I say that in today's lecture, we'll see language as a social and psychological construct that acts as a carrier of cultural heritage. Specifically within language, I'm going to focus on phonology, that is the system of meaningless units and features that convey social meaning. And in particular, you'll accompany me in discovering phonological features that play this function, that allow this attachment to extra-linguistic stuff such as identity, regional or social belonging, and do not believe when you hear that they are extra-linguistic, because I really think that they are at the heart of language. Before going further, you must be aware of some of the most important limitations of this lecture, so things that you will not get from today's talk. So this is simply related to the complexity of some of the basic concepts that are involved in this. So first of those is cultural memory. I have a very limited knowledge of the basic concepts, so you'll discover some as we move along, because I relate them to what I discuss. And you can challenge me at the end, and you will see whether we can go any further. The other concept that is really complex is identity. So identity is a social and psychological construct that exists outside the framework of cultural studies, that is very interdisciplinary, that I do specialize in to some extent in my teachings, although I do not do any research on. So I know that this is really, truly complex and would be the topic of a whole different series of lectures on identity. The third one is about variationist sociolinguistics that I already mentioned, that is really concerned with many of the issues that are raised here today. That is also very vast, so I would not be able to give a meaningful summary, so this is not really the purpose of today's lecture. But we can go back to this perhaps during question time. So how do we study variation? Why? How has it evolved since the beginning, etc. And finally, there are just 3 examples in today's lecture, so that's just a tiny glimpse of potential, many other things that can be just as relevant to the collective identity of Scotland and language. And so the textbook that I recommended you to read, that you can see on this slide, is a very good depiction of the bilingual situation, the history of the linguistic situation of Scots and English in Scotland, from Robert McCall-Miller from 2020. Okay, so this brings me to present the outline of the lecture. In this lecture, we're going to concentrate on selected phonological features of Scots and English spoken in Scotland. And I want to illustrate how these linguistic features capture and perpetuate the region's unique linguistic diversity, cultural experiences, and collective identity. Firstly, a brief analysis of intonation in Scots and English. This will highlight how intonation can serve as a marker of cultural identity. This will be complemented by a very short exploration of how outsiders perceive Scottish voices or accents of Scotland. Secondly, the lecture will examine how speakers shift linguistic styles or code switch between Scots and English. And we're going to explore how these phenomena contribute to the dynamic representation of cultural memory, and the emphasis there will be on dynamic. And lastly, a short, in-depth analysis of current research on epenthesis. Epenthesis is the insertion of a sound within a word. Appendices in lexical items such as film and world will provide insight into how very, very subtle, tiny linguistic nuances reflect very old linguistic influences and tendencies. Okay, so for our discussion on intonation, I'd like you to listen to, again, a short extract to a Scottish voice represented this time by Jackie Kay, a famous poet, contemporary poet, Scottish poet. So she was adopted by Scottish-Nigerian parents and was brought up of these Scottish parents. And she wrote very personal poems about this experience, and we're going to listen to her first collection. So the recording is from 2007 or 2008, as she reads the adoption papers. I would like you to listen to the sound of her voice and how it rises and falls as she recites her poem.
Chapter 3, The Waiting List. The first agency we went to didn't want us on their list. We didn't live close enough to church, nor were we churchgoers, though we kept quiet about being communists. The second told us we weren't high enough earners. The third liked us, but they had a 5-year waiting list. I spent 6 months trying not to look at swings or the front of supermarket trolleys, not to think, this kid I've wanted could be 5. The fourth agency was full up. The fifth said yes, but again, no babies. Just as we were going out the door, I said, well, you know we don't mind the colour. Just like that, the waiting was over. This morning, a slim manila envelope arrives, postmarked Edinburgh, 1 piece of paper. I've now been able to look up your microfiche, as this is all the records kept nowadays. From your mother's letters, the following information. Your mother was 19 when she had you. You weighed 8 pounds, 4 ounces. She liked hockey. She worked in Aberdeen as a waitress. She was 5 foot 8 inches.
Okay. So, what's happening here? So the sound of the voice, or our voice as we speak, rises and falls within and across sentences. And it has multiple functions. One of the most basic functions of intonation is to distinguish between declarative sentences and questions. So we can listen to the 4 basic tones in English that are based on a falling or a rising intonation. I will use a very short extract from the book I used to teach intonation, so that is Peter Roach's English Phonetics and Phonology. You can listen to rising, falling tones first.
Yes. No. Well. For.
And the opposite, a rising tone.
Yes. No. Well. For.
Okay, and technically speaking, when you look at the spectrogram, you can see the pitch of the voice as it rises or falls, and in this illustration, you can see a falling tone. So there also exists a combination of these two, just to give you a complete picture, although this will be not relevant to the point. So this is a 4 rise.
Yes. No. Well. For.
And a rise 4.
Yes. No. Well. For.
So these are the 4 basic tones that you learn about if you take a course in phonology, in English phonetics and phonology. So the speaker will listen to, did not always use a fall on a declarative sentence. Instead, she used what we call a high rising terminal. So a high rising terminal in many accents using a rising pitch in a sentence in many accents will automatically signal a question, or if it's not a strictly speaking question, then it will signal uncertainty or unfinishedness or checking for confirmation. But in other accents, this same rising intonation is common, that is normal to find in statement of facts, so declarative sentences. Now there are two types there of high rising terminals. One of them is called uptalk, and this sort of use of rising intonation is found in speakers from Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Canada. And then there's another type of usage of rising intonation in declarative sentences. This time it is termed urban North British intonation, and is typically found in speakers from Belfast, Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, among other major cities or urban areas in the north of England and around. Now, these urban North British rises are very different from other well-known rising intonation patterns in English, write Nance and her colleagues in a paper specializing in measuring and working on intonation. They say that urban North British rises are the traditional dialect unmarked realization of a declarative sentence. They are said to mark completion or finality rather than having a function of checking, negotiation, or incomplete turns, which have been noted for high rising terminals. So Glasgow English is part of this group, and this is what you could hear in the extract when you heard Jackie Kay reciting her poem. In technical terms, many instrumental studies looked exactly how this functions. So they looked at the spectrogram and the different measures, as in my example earlier. And so, for example, one of the earliest such instrumental specific investigation intonation was from 1997, and I quote, it said, Glasgow English, along with other urban North British dialects, differ from Standard American and RP received pronunciation English in its more frequent use of nuclear rising intonation. In addition, the Glasgow rise is often followed by what Crittenden calls a plateau slump. After the pitch has risen, at the accented syllable, it remains high, that's the plateau, or slightly declining, until very near the edge of the phrase, at which point it falls again. So that's a very tiny technical detail. To our ears, they are practically the same. But more importantly, where do they come from, these rising intonation patterns in declarative sentences? But according to Stefan Willem, uptalk, so again, this is typical in speakers from New Zealand, Australia, and the United States and Canada. They appeared fairly late, fairly recently, after the Second World War for New Zealand and Australia, or later in the 80s, or starting from with the 80s in United States and Canada. What about urban North British intonation? So again, this is using rising intonation in declarative sentences. It's a lot less recent, so it is estimated to may have appeared in the 18th century. Okay, so what have we seen so far? We saw that the way we use the pitch of our voice in English has different functions. One of the most basic of these functions is grammatical, distinguishing a question from a statement. We saw that when a questioning intonation is used on a declarative sentence, it may be simply pragmatic. So this is the uptalk version. Pragmatic functions such as signaling uncertainty, unfinished utterances, checking. And there's also another group of accents that actually have a rising intonation within their system without any pragmatic additional function. So it is just how it is. Okay, now, when we consider this, And we try to place this in the context of the dichotomy of collective versus cultural memory. And this is the table you can find in the original paper, and I think the same table is also in the second paper. So if you refer to Asman's paper, it's on page 117, it's figure 2. So if we attempt to place the two uses of rising intonation, uptalk, and urban North British intonation, and try to see how it works out with collective and cultural memory, well, if you look at the table, and when it comes to the discussion of language, and more particularly of the diglossic situation of high language variety, low language variety, or vernacular versus formalized language, we can see that our particular point here, rising intonation in declarative sentences, falls into two categories. Uptalk is fairly recent, so if we count the years, we have 60 to 80 years, so this is the recent past. It is part of communicative memory. It is specific to a speaker group within a larger group, and we have examples like the Californian Valley Girl intonation, which is really specific and indexes the speaker. And then on the other hand, we have urban North British intonation. It is not ancient. It doesn't go back on 3,000 years, or at least we're really not sure. But it is part of traditional dialects. And if we count the years, we have 300 to 400 years perhaps. And all the speakers of the dialect have it. So it's not particular to a specific group, all the speakers of the group have it. So we can see at the same time, when we try to distinguish between these two categories, as Asman suggests himself later on in the same paper, there could be an in-between, a transition between the binary structure that he presents in this table. Okay, so let me try and recapitulate this first point before moving on to the accent bias, the second point. Do not worry if you feel overwhelmed by the amount of linguistic terms that I'm using today and the different phenomena. I'm sure that you were not expecting to be dealing with this at all. So what I'm trying to show you here is that instead of asking how do Scots represent the past by way of, for example, carefully selected heritage sites or events, or instead of asking how do Scots collectively remember the past, through what element or concepts, I'm asking the question, what is there in language that automatically acts as a mirror to the past, or as a sort of a deep well that takes us back to ancient times? And to spoil the rest of the lecture, I will not be delivering the answers. So this is your job to see how the different language phenomena that I talk about today fit, if they do, fit into the theoretical tools that you get from the other lectures and from the introductory materials, and the concepts that you acquire throughout the course. Okay, and this brings me to a small sideway that I'd like to take after discussing intonation before moving on to code switching. I would like to talk really briefly about the accent bias studies. You have understood by now that I'm a phonologist, and I'm interested in accents for their own sake. So it's not because I'm trying to interpret them in a given framework or ideology. But there is one field in phonology that comes close to identity studies, and that is studies related to accent bias. That is, how are different accents perceived, negatively or positively, by outsiders or by the speakers themselves. As you can read, as Besselmeyer puts it, accents are a way in which speakers pronounce and stress words. These variations in pronunciation of the same language provide important social information about a speaker's ethnic, socio-economic, and geographical background. The ability to differentiate between regional accents and draw social inferences based on accents develops in early adolescence. Much research, particularly in the social sciences, has demonstrated the importance of accents on the social evaluation of the speakers. Now, clearly, speakers do not consciously act on past events here, individually or collectively, but we do have pronunciation features that are anchored to specific places and that become socially salient and thereby have a powerful effect on collective identities. So what about Scottish accents then? In one of the most exhaustive studies on British accents, you can see here on the slide that Scottish accents arrive in the 4th place. This is really good, and it hasn't changed since 1969, where the first study was conducted. This represents how prestigious the different accents sound to the participants of the survey. So starting with received pronunciation there, then French, speaker's own accent, and then next is the Scottish accent, or Scottish accents, because it's several accents. And there's a very similar tendency, without any major change throughout the decades, for pleasantness, so how pleasant a given accent sounds. But there are different Scottish accents, and it is usually Glasgow that is rated the least prestigious in the different variations within Scotland. Now, you may have misgivings about accent bias questionnaires. I certainly do, and I don't think it is easy to tap into convictions and attitudes in a meaningful way, so it's really complicated. But also, if you look at the next figure, having attitudes can be worked on, and it may change. So this comes from a non-academic publication. If you're familiar with YouGov and the surveys and publications, they are published in several countries. There's one that I found interesting. So this shows the self-rated degree of self-consciousness when one speaks in their own accent. So for Scotland, just like in the 4 other major areas that were surveyed in this questionnaire, with almost 3,000 respondents, the majority judges themselves not self-conscious about how they speak at all, or 1/3 saying not very self-conscious, and only 15 plus 4, so 19% said that they were fairly or very self-conscious of their own speech. And this brings me directly to the next point, which is code switching in Scotland. So in order for you to really grasp code switching and what languages there exist to code switch from and to, I'd like to show you a very short clip describing what Scots is, to those of you who are not familiar with this language. So this is a promotional clip that was made by the BBC for the occasion of 2019, the United Nations Year of Indigenous Languages, and it sums up fairly well what Scots is and who the speakers are. So I'll follow the link, and then I'm going to quit the presentation so that you can see it. Oh no, hang on. I have the audio extraction, so we'll just listen to the audio and not watching the clip.
Scotland has 3 indigenous languages, English, Gaelic and Scots. Now we all care about English and Gaelic, but what is Scots? Well, for centuries it was the language of kings, the matters, the court and council documents. It was the national language of Scotland until we won the state in Israel. It was jettisoned by the upper classes after the Act of Union. But I would use a normal Scots folk to leather again. From Hoyt to Thurstal, from Brecon to us. Ouija, Fifer, Border, Doric speakers, and Irish folk like myself. We all grew up with Scots voices round about us, who were never encouraged to speak it. We certainly didn't get to study it like we did English or maybe French at school. I know. Cultural colonisation, they lack the confidence in their own culture. Maybe they should. The Council of Europe, the UK and the Scottish Government all accept Scots as a minority language that needs protected. Now you can read John Steinbeck in Scots, Harry Potter in Scots. Even Outlander uses Scots words all the time. This spring you can study at Scots Open University, and thousands of kids in North Scotland are studying for the SQA Scots language. 2019 is the United Nations Year of Indigenous Languages. So there's going to be hundreds of really cool Scots things happening all over the country. It's a great time for us to re-engage with Scots voices. It's a great time to start tapping 10 in Scots.
Thank you. So different regional varieties of Scots and English are spoken in Scotland together, and most Scots are bilingual and actively code switch between varieties according to the situation or the interlocutors. English remains very Scottish flavored English. And here I'm going to refer to the text that I recommended to read for this class. 2 paragraphs from Robert McCall-Miller's explanation of English and Scotland, the global linguistic situation in Scotland. I quote there, what seems genuine English to a Scot may not be fully comprehensible to many people from outside Scotland and the northern parts of Ireland. The most striking of these divergences have developed over the last 600 years. The greatest of these is the general change in associations in vowel lengths, the Scottish vowel length rule, which came into being from the 17th century onwards in Scottish, some Northern English, and many Irish varieties, altering the nature of the Germanic vowel system. This chapter can therefore be seen both as inaccurate as possible a depiction of local, regional, and national Scots phonology, as a complex idealization of what is actually a far more mixed and sociolinguistically triggered phonological reality. The highlight again is mine. While social background may affect how Scots or English art pronunciations are, it is an undeniable truth that all Scots speakers can move between the systems of the 2 languages, normally at most semi-consciously and without difficulty. Indeed, particular distinctions may not be perceived as being difference between discrete systems, but rather as sociolinguistically triggered variants derived from the same system. So, what does this mean? Well, the last sentence refers to a controversy of one system or 2 systems that the study of bilingual acquisition must tackle. When do 2 simultaneously learned languages become separate entities in the mind of the speaker? Very interesting, extremely interesting question, but not central to us here. But what essentially this introductory chapter of the book on Scots phonology says is that what is usually described as a continuum between Scots and English in Scotland, and if you look up the Wikipedia page, for example, this is what you get in the introductory section. In Scotland, we have this continuum between Scots and standard Scottish English. And on this continuum, each speaker will consciously or semi-consciously switch styles or codes according to the situation. But it also says that in reality, the situation is much more complex than a simple line or continuum between varieties. But code switching, whether in this particular context or any other context that you are personally familiar with, is part of semi-automatic identity and how we build our identity and act linguistically our identity on the individual level, and collectively it draws a portrait of subtle power relations between languages or language varieties and speaker groups. As for cultural memory, it does not really align with the bipolar dichotomic approach framework that I mentioned above, but it was just simply impossible not to mention this linguistic situation in an analysis of Scottish English. It is impossible to fit a truly heterogeneous linguistic situation into neat little lines or neat little boxes. Anyway, the collective linguistic identity of Scottish speakers operates on several levels. And this is in itself is one of the most salient characteristics of Scotland and Scottish speech, one of which you'll right away become aware of as soon as you spend a few days in the country. I have to hurry up. Third and last example, the phonological feature of epenthesis. Now, what is epenthesis? I told you that it's an insertion of an extra sound within a word. If you listen to this example, the text is given, and you'll just concentrate on the pronunciation of the word world in the middle.
Well, I don't, because of the jobs I have, and because we have had to go in the world.
Okay, so there was an extra sound in world pronounced as world. So there were two syllables. Or another example, if you listen to these words, can you find the words? What are they?
126 pearl, 127 pearl.
Okay, let's listen again.
126 pearl, 127 pearl.
Okay, they do sound a bit the same. They are not the same words. So these were the two words. First, the word pearl, then the word peril. Let's listen again.
126 pearl, 127 pearl.
Okay. So this is epenthesis. It's not restricted to specific words. I will not explain the phonological environment in which it occurs. It's not really relevant at all to us today. What I'd like to focus on is where epenthesis comes. Where does it come from? So according to one of the most influential papers on this very specific subject, I'm going to again quote from the author, Warren Maguire. Epenthesis in certain liquid consonant clusters is a well-known feature of varieties of modern Scots. Pronunciations such as phelum for film, arum for arm, boran for born, and curl for curl will be familiar to anyone who has grown up or lived in lowland Scotland. But although this feature has been subject to occasional comment by dialectologists and phonologists, it has never been studied in detail, so that basic facts about its linguistic characteristics and geographical distribution are unknown. And so the rest of the paper is devoted to this. I'm just going to come to the conclusion of the origin of the phenomenon. So apparently in Scotland, we have this epenthesis in written records, different legal texts, as early as the 15th century. And in England, apparently there were similar epentheses in Old English, so that's roughly around 500 to 1100, and Middle English period, recorded in words such as arm and north, so spelled with an extra vowel in them. Now, while in England, the use is continued in certain modern English dialects, well into the 19th century, there is no trace of it now in contemporary English. That is to say, in the south of England. We do hear it in the north of England. So it is part of the linguistic history of Scotland, with a twist, however, because there's currently a difference in sociolinguistic awareness of epenthesis, so this extra little sound, depending on the preceding sounds. So film and arm. The epenthesis in arm, pronounced in two syllables, appears normal, neutral, so okay for Scottish speakers. And the same epenthesis in a word like film does not, so it's negatively connotated. And so the reason must be found in cultural heritage and linguistic history. There is difference in the origin of the two types of epenthesis. Whereas in the 20th century, so in the past century, they are attested equally, so they are equally frequent. If we go back, some further back, less recent history, we have a long shared history with epenthesis with English varieties when the R sound is concerned, and we don't have the same thing when the L sound is concerned, so this difference in perception may come from there, so the different origins. And there is an additional uncertainty about the actual origin of the L epenthesis. Okay. Now, I would like to try and give an overall appreciation of the three different features that I mentioned in this lecture. For each, I would like to concentrate on the dynamic representation of cultural memory. So I started with emphasizing that language, at least phonology, evolves and adapts all the time. And I wanted to be aware that these changes reflect changes in society and historical events, so very simple things like migration and language contact, like the last example, cultural beliefs as to the superiority of language varieties over others, so that concerns code switching and prestigious and less prestigious varieties. And the question is, so what can linguistic research do? Well, it can certainly examine how linguistic features serve as carriers of cultural heritage and put into perspective negative stereotypes. Research can observe changes over time, reminding the speakers that changes in language are normal. They are integral part of language, not only phonology, but language in general. So they are normal and expected. In the dynamic representation of cultural memory, I think that there must be an emphasis on researchers as they examine how language is used in different contexts, often reflecting adaptation to social dynamics. So the most accessible example there is code switching or style shifting. And in a way, language, and there are many other features that I haven't even mentioned today, as a living entity is a mirror that shows us the past, and it also shapes actively cultural evolution. Now, sounds, these meaningless units lending themselves to social indexing in speech. Question is, are they part of cultural memory or cultural memory, so both types? I think that, I started by saying that at the beginning of the lecture, I told you that language, and especially the sounds of language, are stable. They are part of, they are stable in the context of different situations and across generations. Changes are normal, but there is a stability in the system. And I tried to show you that the sound of words are part of cultural memory in that they are stable both in the context that I mentioned, and I refer to one of the texts by Jan Aspen that distinguishes collective memory, that is the near past or past with small letters, from cultural memory, that is an institutionalized version of the past, or memory with capital letters. So the past and this institutionalized memory go further back to the origins, and they mix facts and myths. Now, through the examples, I hope that I was able to show you my point, that is to say, the extraordinary capacity of language to contain and express cultural memory, but, and this is something that does not fit into the current concepts, as I read about them when preparing this lecture. Not all, but most of these processes that I mentioned, and those that I haven't mentioned, are unconscious. So speakers are not necessarily aware of the features, of the different features in their speech. And even when they are conscious of them, it is impossible to pay attention all the time. And no one cultivates the memory of ancient sounds or intonations, or if they do, then that is not naturally part of language. So the sounds of words carry both contemporary, recent, and ancient memory. So today's session is controversial in this way, and as such, an ideal ground for future research. And also to conclude, if I can quote one last passage, this time from the text entitled The Invention of Cultural Memory, A Short History of Memory Studies, page 28. And I'm not going to read the whole passage there. What I'm really interested in is the last 5 lines that I want to comment on. So between the time remembered in the framework of the communicative memory and that remembered in the cultural memory, thus there is a gaping hole, or, using the term coined by the anthropologist Jan van Sina, a shifting, floating gap that moves along with the passage of time. So there seems to be a dynamic and undiscovered interval or transition between the two ends of the spectrum. But this gaping hole is just waiting to be investigated, and I think that language may be a very important element in this research. The key idea of letting go of chronological time, as explained later on page 32, and reinterpreting media, if you go back to the table that I presented earlier on, to abandon this strict opposition between oral versus written, may be the first steps in this direction. Okay. But anyway, so that's all I had time for today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd love to hear your comments and questions.